Esther chapter 8. The 10th lesson of this study already. We are through, we have seen Esther become the queen. We've seen the main villain of the story rear his ugly head. We've seen his demise and all the irony related to that. We've seen God's providence over and over and over. And there is a common theme in many particular places in Scripture, and the book of Esther as a whole is one of those, is one of the examples of that, and that is the theme of deliverance. Deliverance from God, whether it is spiritually or physically or both maybe, or from slavery or from potential danger or from present danger, just deliverance as a whole. You think back to Exodus chapter 3 verses 7 and 8 when God spoke to Moses from that bush, burning bush, and He said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. I have come down to deliver them out of the land of Egypt, out of the hand of the Egyptians." So Moses was the instrument that God used to deliver the Israelites, the Hebrews, from the Egyptian bondage. And there are other men and women used by God in the Scriptures to deliver people. Think about the period of the judges. Every one of those judges was a deliverer. They weren't judges like, standing up and hearing cases and, saying, okay, this person gets this and this person gets nothing. Not that kind of judge. They were really military leaders who God raised up to deliver the Israelites every time a foreign nation rose up to oppress them during that 350 or so year period. Zerubbabel is another deliverer that we read about in Ezra chapter 2. And several others we could mention, but Esther surely has to make the list somewhere. And Mordecai, they were kind of a team. But since the book is called Esther, it's mainly about Esther's role in that, or that's what's emphasized. We've already seen her courage. We've seen her humility. We've seen her resolve. Just going to the king in the first place was enough of courage that we saw, considering she very well could have been killed, put to death, because she went to him without being summoned, which was a no-no. You don't do that. The laws of the Persians and Medes stated that the penalty was death unless the king basically spared your life by saying, it's okay, don't worry, and letting them in. So because of Esther's efforts, the Jews were in the process, I guess you could say, of being delivered. Haman had risen up just because of his personal issue with Mordecai, who turned out to, as far as Haman was concerned, to be a Jew. He was going to destroy all the Jews. And the date has been set. The law has been put into place that cannot be revoked. Well, the last couple lessons we've seen, Haman was his personal animus towards Mordecai was reignited, and he was going to put an end to him. He couldn't wait another 10 months for that. So he was going to put an end to Mordecai, and that backfired in a full 180. Totally brought back on his own head, which is another theme in Scripture. reiterated a number of times, that your deeds will come back on you. That literally happened with Haman. And he was put to death on the very contraption that he had built for Mordecai. And that is how chapter 7 ends from last week's lesson, chapter 6 and 7. It ends with Haman being put to death. However, it's not over. The story's not over, and the danger's not over, because the only thing that was thwarted in chapter 7 was Mordecai's own life was saved. That was it. It was not saved forever, obviously, but it was saved in the immediate events that Haman was trying to make happen. What still remained, though, was everything else. The thing that Esther had gone to the king about in the first place. You see, Esther had nobody had any idea about Mordecai's immediate danger, because that had been kept, not really kept secret, because it had barely been any time, but Haman had been going to the king to tell him about it the day that he had to go honor Mordecai, that very day, and he never got to mention it to the king, and turned out to be the last day of his life, and so it was never mentioned. So nobody knew about that. What Esther and Mordecai were working to do something about was the law that Haman had already put into place, which was that on this day, in the 11th month, the Jewish people are to be destroyed. Anybody who wants to take part on this day, kill Jews, whatever Jew you might have access to, know about, anywhere you find them. It will be totally legal and acceptable to murder these people on this day. That is still in effect, because it's been written and it can't be revoked. So, lest we get the impression that, oh, what a sigh of relief, Haman's dead, so it's all over, far from it. Nothing has changed except Haman's dead, and Mordecai is not going to be put to death on the contraption that he had built. There's another theme in Scripture that we come across, maybe not frequently, but at least consistently, is respect for authority. Honor and respect, not just for authority, but those who are worthy of that honor and respect. God would be at the top of the list always. Hebrews 12:28-29, we must serve God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Jesus was honored by the Father on that mountain. This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. He's worthy of honor and respect, obviously. But we're also to show honor to government officials, as much as we may not want to. And I think it would do us a lot of good to remember the kind of government that they had in the time the New Testament was written. At the time, for instance, when Paul wrote in Romans 13 that we are to be submissive to the civil authorities, no matter what kind of morals or lack thereof some of our leaders might have in their personal lives, we have to understand these people were wholly, utterly corrupt to the fullest extent of the word in many instances, mistreated people, no justice. Just go live over there. If we had a time machine, just go live, hop in, go back to the first century in the Roman Empire, and you'll see what injustice looks like. And Persian Empire as well, for that matter, probably even worse. But nevertheless, Paul said, submit to the authorities. They have been put there by God. Period. The institution of civil government in itself is something that God has instituted, and therefore to resist them is to resist God Himself. So bestowing honor and respect on those who are worthy, that's also going to play a role in this lesson. The pace sort of slows down again here in the book of Esther, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it really picked up, and it was really a climactic event. Now we're pumping the brakes again, but the turmoil and potential devastation is still hanging over like a dark cloud. So, first couple verses of chapter 8 says this: On that day, King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Remember, I already alluded to it. After learning about Haman's plan, he sentenced him to death, and he was put to death right then, right that day. He was put to death. So now he's dead, and his house, I guess, which would include his station, his incomes, that kind of thing. Mainly in this verse, his incomes probably. Whatever else he owned. It seems that his family would have been somewhat brought low by this as well. He gave it to Esther. Apparently it was customary for the king to take possession of in these kinds of circumstances. Well, instead of Xerxes taking it, he gave it to Esther. Whatever was Haman's was now Esther's. And notice he's called the enemy of the Jews, Haman. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. We may have taken it for granted that the king already knew that. We know that it had been revealed that she was a Jew. She had not revealed anything about Mordecai. Because remember, Mordecai wasn't really anybody to the king. The king is the king, and he's, way up in the clouds, basically. All Mordecai was to him was one of the people who relatively recently, saved his life by informing the officials that he heard about that plot to assassinate the king. Other than that, Mordecai was nobody. It's not like they saw each other every day, and the king, they were on, first name basis and everything. But now the queen reveals to him that he is her he's her next of kin, and more than that even, he's basically her father. For all intents and purposes, he's her father. Which, it means something, obviously. Because as a result, it says in verse 2, that the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Here we also learn, if it wasn't implied before, that the king giving Haman the signet ring wasn't just a one-time thing. That would have been foolish enough. But it was a more permanent thing. Maybe not absolutely permanent, but it says that now that Haman had been put to death, he took the signet ring back from Haman. So Haman had the luxury of just having that thing, which was a huge amount of power and sway and pull. Now he takes it and gives it to Mordecai. So of all the evil, the amount of power that a person gives to somebody else heavily depends, the outcome of that heavily depends on the character of that person. You put it in Haman's hands, this is the most horrendous, devastating thing we could imagine. Haman has the signet ring, nobody's safe, You put it in the hands of a man like Mordecai, and it's the total opposite end of the spectrum. This is one of the greatest things that could happen. And again, that is solely based on the character of the individual, which should say something to us about those of us who have the luxury of being able to elect our officials, the kinds of character people, at least in their service of ruling, we would prefer them to have and not prefer them to have. So now Mordecai has that ring, and he has been set over the house of Haman. So, like we already saw in verse 1, the king gave it to Esther, but Esther's not going to run a house. She's not going to take Haman's place. That wouldn't even be right, from the perspective of I'm the queen. She's the queen. She's not going to... Haman's obviously lower than the queen as far as that goes. but she gives it to Mordecai. So Mordecai gets a promotion. So whether this includes all the things that he owned or his station and his position, Mordecai just keeps flip-flopping, doesn't it? I mean, Mordecai is basically Haman. Everything bad that was intended for Mordecai happened to Haman, and everything good that had happened to Haman is now coming around to Mordecai. So this is a good step for the Jews. Still, nothing's been done. Keep in mind, nothing has been done yet, except the king has been told about it. This is another one of those instances where it's just should be beyond obvious that having a law that no law can be revoked is not a smart system. It's not smart. It's one thing for the system of law to be very difficult to, once a law has been enacted, it's very difficult to get it taken away. Well, that's even true in our system of law. But for it to actually be embedded into the system that no law can be revoked, period, is terrible, terrible idea. And of the two instances we read about in the Old Testament where it got a good person or good people in a lot of deep water with Daniel in the lion's den and Mordecai and the Jews and Esther in the book of Esther, that's enough to show it's a little too easy to compromise that law, that arrangement they have. All you have to do is deceive the king, and evil, wicked people can get whatever they want, no matter how evil it might be. Like, I don't like this person, I want them to die, so I'm going to trick the king into getting them killed. So nothing's been done. But things are still unfolding, and clearly God is at work here. So next few verses, beginning of verse 3. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king," notice how careful. "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king." Let's not overlook the fact that she seems to have once again gone in uninvited. Again, she's had to do this, or she's resolved to do this. Otherwise, the king, it seems, based on the earlier example, the king wouldn't have had to hold out the scepter because she would have been brought before him. So she risked her life again, but then she's still very careful. She fell at his feet, already wept. "If it please the king, and if I found favor in his sight, and if you're okay with it, and if I'm pleasing in his eyes." She proposed the best possible option, that a law be written, a letter be written, an order be written to revoke everything Haman. Undo, erase, say that thing that was written and that was set for this day is no go, off. It's all off. That's what she asked for. And who can blame her? Because that is, as far as right and wrong goes, maybe not be according to the law of the Persians, but as far as objective right and wrong goes, since that thing was predicated and totally devised based on deceit and craftiness, it shouldn't apply. Just like somebody wins a championship, turns out they cheated, they should not, that's revoked, because it was not done properly. They cheated and their trophy or medal is revoked or whatever. Well, it's just common sense that that's the way it should be in this case. It was evil and immoral and done on deceitful terms. But the king informs her, can't do it. In fact, the way he responds seems to suggest that he thinks he's done enough already. He says, behold, I've given Esther the house of Haman, and they've hanged him on the gallows. How is that a response? She just asked that an order be written to revoke what he set in motion. The king says, "Well, I've given you his house, and I've hanged him." What he's saying is, isn't that enough? That's kind of the unspoken. I've already done this. He's dead. Aren't you satisfied? The man is dead. Well done. You succeeded. But he goes ahead and he says, okay, but if you wish, you can write whatever you want. You can do what Haman did. Right? As you please in this matter with regard to the Jews, in my name, and you can seal it with my ring. You can't revoke the law. It can't be that law is to be ignored. And again, it's just so difficult for us in our minds to understand why that couldn't be done. It's still a new law, right? Kind of. It's still this law. This edict says to ignore the other edict. But for whatever insane reason, they can't do that. So he says, whatever you want to figure out, I'm not going to put much more thought and mental energy into this. I'm not going to try to come up with the most effective way to do it. If you want to do it, do it. Yeah, Dean? Yeah. Yeah. Maybe a lesson here on the danger of, continuously instituting new laws, which is a lesson that's very applicable today. Our system at least, has pretty much built in that, it's kind of good as it is, but we need people to uphold the laws that we have, not people who want to just keep making more and more and more. Yeah. Yep. Jephthah, yeah. Horrifying. Terrible situation. Not smart at all. Yeah. That reminds me, though, that, another thing that Esther was very diplomatic and careful about is in no way implying that the king shared some blame in this predicament in the first place, which, by the way, he did. Yes, he was deceived, but maybe he could have paid a little more attention, and maybe not. At least, whenever it's as vague as what Haman pitched to him, that there is this certain people in your kingdom that don't uphold your laws, and they're influencing other people to rebel or whatever, and they should just all be exterminated. Well, that's such a massive deal that you would at least maybe want to ask some questions. Or say, okay, I've heard your pitch. Now, let's look into this matter. Who are these people? Let's look into it. Yada, yada, yada. But he didn't do any of that. He just trusted Haman and that. So he was at least 30% to blame. It kind of seems like 50-50 almost, but maybe not quite 50-50. But he did bear some of the blame. But Esther never even remotely suggests, and many of us we would not have been able to do that. We would have kind of maybe thought it gave a little bit more power to our argument that, you shouldn't have let him do it in the first place. But that would have been the end. I think, based on what we know about Xerxes, that would have been the end of it. once you insult him personally, you might as well be, talking to the wind, because it's not going to go anywhere. So she very carefully presented it, didn't implicate him at all, and he gives them the freedom to write whatever they want to write, short of that other law is to be ignored and revoked, because you can't do that. Because like he said, there at the end of verse 8, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So just like that one couldn't be revoked, whatever they write also will not be able to be revoked. So, verse 9 says, the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of the king, of King Xerxes, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud. And now finally we get to see what he wrote. Doesn't even tell us what he wrote, just says concerning to all that he wrote, commanded concerning the Jews. Now we see what it was. Saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So they couldn't write, the king could not put out an edict that said that law that we put into place is now canceled. But he did let them write what they saw fit, what they saw best. And here's another good example of the risk involved when you give somebody the signet ring and tell them they can write whatever they want. Because if Mordecai had been less of a godly man than he was, he could have written anything. I mean, he could have written anything, but he could have said, all the people that may have taken part in this are to be killed, on the first day of the 4th month. We'll just go ahead and make sure it doesn't happen by killing everybody that may have taken part. So that way it won't happen. The 12th month, what is it, the 13th day of the 12th month, nothing will happen, because anybody that may have made something happen will already be dead. He could have written that. The king would have been totally fine with it. But Mordecai was a better man than that. And he was very conservative and very, what we might call spiritually careful, morally careful, and simply put in that on that day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews are allowed to gather together like an army, we're all going to gather together as a team and defend their lives up to killing any armed forces. I think that's significant too. You don't just because this is a free ride or whatever, a freebie from the king, that doesn't mean you just go wild and if you see somebody that you think looked at you funny, then they must be one of them, so you kill them. Any armed force on that day, on that one day, you're able to defend yourselves. That's it. I don't think there is another more conservative idea or resolution than that, as far as conservative in the sense of you're not going overboard or stooping to the level of the enemy in the first place, but all it is, even if the king had to review it first and approve it, there's no way that would have gotten denied because it's so reasonable. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for, reasonable. Yeah, Dean? Yeah.
I'm sure that God had to, have a take part in this, where that, I would say, we don't know that it did, God did speak to Mordecai, but it seemed like he influenced him enough to be able to write something like this, that where it would not, really,
Yeah.
all they were doing was to defend themselves.
Totally reasonable.
That's
Yeah.
what we do.
Yeah. And, I probably also should point out that just because he wrote in the edict that as far as the king was concerned, killing is acceptable, that's not to, we shouldn't assume that means that Mordecai and some of the others would have done that. They may have been more reserved, maybe not go to the extent of killing them, but the point is, as far as the law was concerned, you will not face criminal punishment if you end up on that day having to take someone's life, an armed person's life who's trying to take your life on that day. The 12th day, no. 14th day, no. Just the Adar the 13th, you're allowed to gather together and defend yourselves up to, even if it means taking the lives of anyone who's armed and trying to take your life. We know that, like Dean said, we're not told whether God had any direct part in this with Mordecai, like, spoke like he did with Noah and said, this is what I'm going to do and this is what you're going to do. And here he said, okay, this is what's happening, so Mordecai, I want you to write this exact thing as the edict. But we do know that Mordecai was a godly man who knew right and wrong. He knew God's will, and he knew the boundaries of that. He knew the ethical and moral way to do it. And we can understand that he was influenced by God to the extent that he wrote this edict in accordance with God's revealed will. If only that was the way things were still done today. They were 200 years ago here in our country. That's what one of the biggest things that is changing in our nation. That is no longer under consideration whenever it comes to laws. It's all about what do I want, what do these people want, irrespective of whether or not that thing is right or wrong, and especially irrespective of what the Bible says about it. So Mordecai wrote what Mordecai wrote because he knew what God would want. He knew God's will. And so his character and his godly disposition led him to do everything he did. That's what Paul meant when he talked about being led by the Spirit. Rather than by the desires of the flesh, is I want what God wants to be the motivating factor in my life. If God wouldn't be pleased with that thing, I don't want to do that thing. Yeah, do you have something else? Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to predict what might come in the near future. We do have a little bit of a say in that as far as voting, because the people who are in power will greatly. They may not be godly people, but if they're constitutional people, then they will uphold what our Constitution says. But the thing is, we have God's Word, and so we can know what God will want in a given matter. He may not say, the Bible may not speak to a situation explicitly like, should I take this job, or should I take this job, or should I keep my own job with the job I already have. You're not going to find anything in the Scriptures where, oh, yeah, because of book, chapter, verse, I should take this job. Or we're not going to be able to pray to God and say, God, show me some kind of sign, make my bedroom lamp turn blue if you want me to take this one, make it turn green if you want me to take this one, or red if you want me to take this one, and expect that to happen. But we can use the principles of Scripture to base our decision. That's what Mordecai did. That's what Paul did. That's what Jesus did. That's what that's what every godly person should do. Base your decisions, not just, one-time decisions about a career path, but every decision. It doesn't have to be a big, long, process every time. We should study and read the Scriptures enough and learn them enough so that we don't have to take a big, long process, but it becomes more as close to natural as it can. Because I know this thing is, when we know what's right and what's wrong, as soon as you are presented with a dilemma, you know instantly. You know that's not right. So there's the answer. It's just like that. If we are familiar enough with God's revealed will, and that's what studying books like Esther helps with. It's not the primary thing to go to, but there are lessons in all of this that let us know more about God. Even in a book that doesn't even mention God, we learn about God. Whenever we put it together with other Scriptures especially. So, now something has been put in motion as a safeguard for the Jews. It's not foolproof. It doesn't revoke the other thing. But it could deter people. Once this law goes out, before it was like a free bloodbath, Now, the king has written into law that the Jews can fight back. And they're going to be ready. Well, maybe I'll stay home that day then. I was kind of looking forward to it. Now, not so much. So it could be a deterrent. But mainly, it's a very reasonable and, who could object? It's so reserved and reasonable of a resolution. So, applications. There are things much more important than physical wealth. Well, where do we get that from this? Well, from the beginning. Esther was I got a feeling Haman was pretty rich. Haman seemed to think so. And, the writer here alluded to how he talked about all his wealth and everything. Haman was a slippery snake and just one of the most untrustworthy people and pathetic, narcissistic, puffed up people you could imagine. But I don't think he would just brag about all his wealth if he didn't have it. At least maybe he would, but we don't get the impression that he was lying about it. He actually had it. He was rich. He had risen very much in power, and that usually means very high in money. Esther was now given all that. But it's almost like it meant nothing to her. Because not only did she instantly give it to Mordecai, but her concern was still for the welfare of her people. That's all she cared about. It didn't distract her from the danger, even for a little bit. It's not like she got all wrapped up in her money and all this new stuff she has inherited, and then a month later she's like, oh wait, I forgot about the whole thing. But it didn't distract her for a second. 1 Timothy 6:7 says, we brought nothing into the world, can't take anything out of the world. Matthew 16:26, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Rhetorical question. Answer, nothing. Won't profit you anything. You gain the whole world, not profit you anything? Absolutely. Because in the process, you will have forfeited your soul. Not worth it. There are things much more important than physical wealth. And number 2, King Xerxes' willingness to elevate Mordecai to Haman's former position is something that we shouldn't underestimate or overlook. He was not a godly man at all. We know that already. And like I've alluded to, there are his secular accounts of this man that would show that even more so than the book of Esther shows. But he still recognized sincerity, the moral uprightness of Mordecai, so that he knew that he would be a good man to elevate to this position, and that his kingdom would be better for it. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? And that's not just in matters of government leadership, but amongst us regular people, even people who don't want to follow Jesus, whether they want to admit it or not, as far as behavior is concerned, they want everybody else to, because at the end of the day, those are the best people. You can trust them. You can be at peace with them. You can, they can be entrusted with things or even your own life. They are good, morally upright people who are honest. So even ungodly people are able to recognize uprightness and godliness and sincerity, and even men like Xerxes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of another thing that is probably worth noting and pointing out, that, why would Mordecai want to save the king's life? He was wicked, he was evil, he was a scumbag, pardon my French. That's pretty much what he was. Why would Mordecai, this is where the line of morality is very muddy for some people, or from another perspective, it's very bold between one camp and another camp. Don't you think it would have been better for the empire, for Esther, his daughter basically, and for so many other people, if this man was dead? So if I heard about a plot to assassinate him, I'm going to close my little ear and turn my little head and pretend like I didn't hear anything. So why would Mordecai, a man like this, save that man's life? The answer is because murdering him would have been wrong. See, it's always the same. God's principles and laws are always the same. It's not situational, has nothing to do with what kind of person that is, has nothing to do with how good they are. Murdering someone is wrong. Whether they are the king, whether they're the plumber, no matter what, it will be wrong, period. Mordecai was a man who understood right and wrong. And, it should be no different for us today. We may not approve of a leader, but we may not approve of a certain leader getting elected, but we should also not approve of that man or woman getting assassinated, because that would be wrong. And we should take Mordecai's example in that. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yep. At the end of the day, Mordecai, he is going to do the thing that is right, according to God's will. He's not perfect, But that was his resolve, just like Paul. I aim in all things to do what's well-pleasing to God. Period. Has nothing to do with me at the end of the day or this person. I'm going to do to this person the thing that is right, no matter who this person is. That's what Jesus taught to do too. How much of a pat on the back are you worthy of if you're good to those who are good to you? I mean, that's nothing. Everybody does that. What about being good to those who are not good to you? That's the challenge. That's where you're elevating your own moral character, or praying for those who persecute you. You persecute those who persecute you, you're no better than anybody. You pray for those who persecute you, now you're really showing yourself to be having the Spirit of God. So, what is the right thing? If this thing is wrong, it's always wrong, period. Don't have to do any figuring. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Assassinating the king by some evil plot, deceitful, murmuring, whispering plot is wrong, period. So Mordecai was just doing what any of us should do in his position, and let somebody know. So he's a good person to have in Haman's place. Arguably the best at this point in their history. He would have been the best person to have in that place. And we need godly people like Mordecai in positions of power, whether it's in the church or in the state. Any other thoughts, comments, or questions? Okay.
If Mordecai were just turned his head, which obviously he didn't, wouldn't that mean he would be going against God's own authority, because God has the authority to put others in authority?
Yeah.
That they're supposed to submit to the authorities above them unless it's against God's.
Yeah, it would have been wrong in a number of ways, yeah. That's one of them, that because he did hear. He may not have been trying to hear over here, but he did hear it, and he knew. See, that was enough for him. Even though nobody else knew, he heard it. And that he could, as far as the world was concerned, the worldly side of it, he could have gotten away with it. Nobody would have ever known he heard it. And nobody would have ever thought, I think Mordecai is to blame a little bit for the king being killed, because nobody knew he heard it. But he knew he heard it, and so if he ignored it, then he was going against God, because that's not right. And the right thing is the thing that should always be done. And it is possible to know what the right thing is when we understand God's will and how it is immovable in that way. None of that situational, circumstantial stuff. What is right is always right, and what is wrong is always wrong.